Well, to discuss the future of what we watch and consume, I'm joined by Fianna Fáil Senator Malcolm Byrne, Dr. Finola Doyle O'Neill from UCC, who is on the Future of Media Commission, Paul Farrell, who is Managing Director of Virgin Media Television, Seamus Dooley is Irish Secretary of the National Union of Journalists, and Adrian Weckler, Tech Editor with the Irish and Sunday Independent. We also invited RTÉ's Director General Dee Forbes to take part in this discussion tonight, but she was unavailable. To come to you first, Finola, when we're talking about this, you were on the Commission, you made 50 recommendations, 49 of which were given the green light and approved by government. They're in favour of them. But funding, and the licence fee in particular, has always been a contentious issue. And you'd like to see that coming directly from the Exchequer. Why do you think that's such a good idea?
Well, first of all, can I say that this was a very considered report, Claire? And what's really important is that it is a bit upsetting for us that the 49 recommendations are not being highlighted and that the one recommendation that wasn't endorsed isn't. So just to go to your point, we felt perhaps that there was something archaic about the hybrid system as it is at the moment. And we know that for example, Ireland is an outlier in terms of the licence fee, that we're only one of 19 countries who still have a licence fee. But moreover, we're only one of 5 countries that actually have it directly linked to the traditional television set. The other countries have it linked to other devices around the house and so forth. So we just felt that in terms of revenue, that would be probably more equitable, that people would pay their tax rate and would also pay in terms of what they can pay in terms of their tax towards the licence fee. But I think it's really, really important to note that if there's a proper system that is consolidated in terms of, we know there's very, very high levels, for example, of evasion, and there's not enough punitive measures. And by that I mean that not enough people are actually being penalised for evading the licence fee. So we're not totally against the fact that the hybrid model is totally out of the question. We're just saying that there needs to be an awful lot of enhancement of the current system, and there needs to be much more due process. And people need to be aware of the fact that RTÉ, and I'm no apologist for RTÉ, but RTÉ and the national broadcaster, as well as Virgin Media, they provide very strong public service viewing. And really people, I think €160 at the moment, for a lot of people is probably not too much to pay. But at the moment, it's not paying its way. And so the Media Commission had other alternatives, and that was one of them, Exchequer funding.
Yeah, what about the alternatives and exploring those alternatives and the issue around Exchequer funding? What's the big issue there? Like, do you share those concerns about, government being seen to have too much of an influence on what the national broadcaster is airing?
Well, I think, first of all, Claire, I think that there's a lot of credit is due to Finola and all of those who are involved under the chairmanship of Byrne McCrath in producing this report. I had hoped that it would have been published sooner. And I think if we look at the 49 recommendations that were accepted, they cover a broad range of areas, including how we deal with disinformation, misinformation, how we ensure trusted journalism, how we support local and regional media, which are all very important elements.
Just on the subject of the licence fee.
On the licence fee, I think there were a number of options considered. Government's concern is that if we look at direct funding from the Exchequer, which is the alternative model, get rid of the licence fee and that government makes a decision to fund the national broadcaster, that kind of arm's length principle of funding would be broken. And the fear is, whether it'll be a perception or a reality, that some future government may decide, we don't like what RTÉ as the national broadcaster is doing, and we will cut the funding. And certainly there is evidence in some countries, and I'm thinking about Hungary and Poland, even within the European Union, where clearly government is overstretching when it comes to the national broadcaster and to media. And we've been very fortunate in Ireland that we have trusted, valued public broadcasting that is provided by RTÉ, but indeed quality balanced broadcasting by this station and indeed by our local media as well.
The funding model has been deemed to be inefficient. So the overhaul that the Taoiseach, has agreed to and is looking at, that's now going back to the table, isn't it? And we're going to have to wait to November to hear more on that.
Yeah, well, this is part of the problem. I mean, the issue needs to be addressed very quickly. There is the problem with regard to evasion. We've got to ensure that there is a sufficient fund that is there to fund RTÉ, to fund the Sound and Vision fund. I would be very concerned that, we go to a situation where we have another report and then there is consideration as to what to do with that. I think it's essential that the expert group is set up, that it's running, that it does report, and the government gives a commitment that it will act on the findings of that.
I mean, there is an urgency around this, would you think, Paul, around, making a decision and really providing funding in an efficient way for public service broadcasting. What do you think of the current model?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of urgency. I think I'd agree with Malcolm. I think a lot of credit should go to the Commission. I think it's a very good report, very inclusive and broad in terms of the contributions that went into it. My major criticism of the report would be, linking to your question, there's some significant legislation passing through the Houses at the moment around media safety, copyright and media regulation, which will be regulating the industry for the next considerable time. And the Commission's report would have been instrumental in terms of the debate around that legislation and what would be required. And it's been sat on for a year, almost a year now, in terms of facilitating that debate. So that's my main frustration with the report. I agree with a lot of the recommendations. I also would agree on the funding piece. I wouldn't agree with the Taoiseach in terms of the dangers of the government controlling the media. I think that is a fear potentially, but I don't think it's meaningful. I think for us, the funding model as it currently stands lacks accountability, contestability and any sort of transparency. So RTE and TG4 spend about 400 million a year on content creation, and there's very little transparency. I think there should be more contestable funds around how other media organisations. I think the Commission's report very clearly defined what public media content was, and that's not the sole preserve of RTE, and it shouldn't be.
So you're saying is when the funding is given out, it should specifically go to what is deemed to be in the public service, and the likes of commercial and sports rights and
local newspapers, local radio stations,
kind of
new digital should all have access to the funding.
To come from
because what we never look at in the context of the licence fee is value for money.
Okay, value for money. Seamus, Dooley, I know the NUJ believes public service broadcasting, it's a key part of our democracy, but would you agree that the model is essentially broken, certainly from a funding point of view?
The model has been broken for a number of years, and we have to be real. This is no way to run a circus. Richard Bruton announced the establishment of a commission on the future of public service broadcasting in 2020, which is going to report 2019, going to report in 2020 for inclusion in the budget in 2021. There was then a general election, a new commission was established, and the government decided that they would announce a commission of experts which would report by September of last year. It reported. The government then launched the report a year later, and one of the recommendations, the key recommendation in relation to the funding of public service broadcasting, is what do? We'll appoint another panel of experts.
What do you think of that view from government that we heard from Micheál Martin there about sort of state control over what the national broadcaster is?
Well, I think there's an inherent contradiction in this, because the Commission report includes the establishment of a media fund, which I welcome, and I believe that will help develop public interest journalism across what are perceived as particular public service broadcasters. That's going to be funded by government. Currently, government funds grants through the Department of Foreign Affairs, including the Simon Cumbers system. The Broadcasting Authority of Ireland is appointed by government and runs a sound and vision scheme.
What's holding up the show? Because clearly...
All of those are actually funded by government.
I'm just thinking, clearly the current model, as outlined by Finola, they don't think they're getting enough money in, and there's people not paying the licence fee, people have an issue with it. So I'm just wondering about the political reticence then to take it from the
I genuinely don't know, because if reports were to solve this, it would have been solved years ago. A number of bodies, including the BAI and indeed Oireachtas commissions, have recommended reform. So, it's profoundly depressing. And this is a really imaginative report which could transform the media landscape in Ireland, and lack of political courage because they're afraid of the public reaction is what has informed this.
Adrian, of course, what the media bubble and the market we're talking about now has hugely transformed since the 70s, when everyone was sitting around watching TV and listening to the radio. There weren't, that many outlets. It's all changed now, and you've big tech in the picture too.
Absolutely. So if you take a company like Twitter, for example, which even at the low ebb it's at the moment would be worth more than all but one or two of the world's biggest media companies, it's ludicrous to suggest that a figure like Elon Musk or Joe Rogan even as a podcaster doesn't move markets and doesn't move culture discussions as well. The big warning for us in this country is coming from the US, where the society is literally disintegrating at the moment, and a huge part of that is the media over there. They don't really have a public service remit. They don't have an equivalent of a BBC, and for all the criticism it gets, RTE. In general, media in this country and in a lot of European countries is the glue that keeps society together. And overall, I think the report, it's good to see the report recognises this. However, that's dispersed.
Yeah, but it's all change as well. You're saying that it's the glue that holds it together. But if you look at the likes that we're seeing, you know, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, they're all now veering into the mainstream. This is where many people get their news, get their information, get their content.
It is, but if you look at the biggest accounts on a lot of those platforms, take YouTube, for example, a lot of them would be established media entities, would be CNN, would be The Guardian, yes, Fox News as well. The real worry that we have is on platforms like Facebook, where if you look at the top 10 engaged media companies on that, a lot of them are companies we've never heard of, the Daily Caller. These would be entities that, generally speaking, are divisive and operate at the edge of political debate. And that's the big concern in terms of TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook. So that's why you do actually need a professional media at the core to help steer this debate.
Yeah, the question is it strong enough to counter that, Paul? I'm thinking about, you know, as the commercial sector is facing a very challenging economic time. You're saying you're not getting enough of a slice of the pie from public funding, and also you've got big tech taking all the ad revenue.
Yeah, I mean, that's the huge challenge. As Adrian said, I think Google, Facebook, Twitter, TikTok account for 56% of the advertising market now. That's more than doubled in the last 8 years. So, you know, from a commercial point of view, our only source of income is advertising, and the market is growing, you know, beyond our control through platforms who, you know, have low or little accountability across the globe. And I think that's why I mentioned the copyright directive earlier. I mean, but for actions in Australia now, you wouldn't see Google contributing. But again, Google aren't publishing any of the money they're contributing to local publishers. They don't treat video as a content provider, so they won't support video or broadcasting. So there's huge issues still to be addressed in this field.
Yeah, why aren't we doing something about that? Australia have taken that great leap.
Well, we actually have made a recommendation. And if you take a look at the precedents in France, under Article 15, they have now sourced that people will get paid for their news sources. And we need to do that here in Ireland, and that's one of our recommendations. And I think it's really important, Claire, also just to highlight that, you know, we do spend a lot of time talking about the licence fee, but again, you know, Seamus has mentioned, and I feel very gratified by the endorsement that the report has, but we have such strong 49 recommendations, which will really be catalysts for change and very transformative for our society. Down to the regional, years ago, when Michael T. Higgins was Minister for Arts, Culture and the Gaeltacht, he produced a report on local media and talked about it being the heartbeat of the community. So we're also kind of endorsing that we need to go back to court reporting, community reporting. We need to service media literacy, media education. And what's really important as well, I just look around our panel here, diversity is one that we've really pushed, and we felt that, you know, this commission, we met 25 times, oftentimes 5 or 6 hours a piece at meetings. You know, they weren't all the time convivial. We had lots of open debate because we were a very independent body. So an awful lot of work went into this, and I hope it won't be eclipsed by the whole issue about the licence fee.
Well, the whole thing is about funding. You're talking about diversity, you're talking about things that need to be done. I mean, the argument there is we're not necessarily seeing the diversity. Like, there are a lot of issues. So why should we pump more money into that?
Well, I think one thing, and Paul made reference to, this week in the Shannons, we passed all stages of the Online Safety and Media Regulation Bill, which is going to be setting up a new media commission, which is potentially the most powerful regulator in Ireland. It's going to be regulating all aspects of media, including the social media companies for the first time.
Will it have teeth?
It has to. And by the way, it also will have a role in the area of media literacy, which is something that's particularly crucial, and encouraging diversity in media, a diverse range of voices.
Media Regulations Commissioner as well.
So we also stitched specifically into the legislation as well. There will be an online safety commissioner. It has to have teeth. Because this is crucial, not just around media regulation and how stations like this will operate, but as Adrian was talking about, how crucial it is to our democracy, how crucial it is, as Finola said, to our local communities. And Seamus will know about the importance of local radio, local newspapers who are under serious funding threats at the moment.
I mean, and let's talk about that, because I think that's one of the recommendations is this 0% VAT, isn't it, on sort of accessing on newspapers for sale. Do you think that would make a difference? I think the government are stating, well, look, that's an EU issue when it comes to tax.
That's one of the proposals, and I would have to say I think the newspaper owners have to convince that if they do that they won't simply increase the price and benefit directly. That there has to be some link with that, with investment in editorial resources. But on the point, I mean, there's a few things I want to point. First of all, RTE, for instance, never looked for an increase in the licence fee. There was no request for an increase in the licence fee. You could gain money, and you could significantly simply improve in the collection system and could improve it in a way which would broaden the mandate to allow money outside of RTE and TG Car. That is entirely possible. I have some concerns around the recommendations of the Media Commission in relation to the new commissioner, because it becomes an all-singing, all-dancing, very powerful body, actually more powerful than government in some respects. And I think there is a need for separation between training and development. And I think you could have a separate body than that. Okay. You now have a body that does that and media regulation and everything else in between. And I think that's going to be a very busy and probably too busy body.
Too busy body. Okay, let's hear.
I think that is really potential for real interference.
Let's hear what RTE had to say just about this report and where it should go. Strongly impress upon the Minister of the need to ensure that any legislative changes and system reforms are progressed as quickly as possible and within the lifetime of this government. So no pressure, although we've talked about what some see here as a lack of political will to date on it. Just back to the local newspapers, Adrian. The idea that newspapers and local media can be more influential than the likes of Facebook, social media platforms, is that a reality?
Well, in 2022, the reality is that local newspapers, like local politicians, generally leverage the likes of Facebook and YouTube and Instagram for their influence and for their reach. We are entering a very interesting time, though. How do you say that somebody who maybe does a lot of work, maybe does a lot of minority information work, for example, has a Patreon account, charges a $5 a month, and let's say might have 20,000 subscribers there. How do you value that person's contribution to local media or to national media against, say, a local paper that might have 12,000 subscriptions? How do you rate somebody who has set up a YouTube account about environmental awareness, for example, that has 100,000 followers?
Because they don't fall under any regulation. They wouldn't be entitled to anything under a sound and vision fund or any of that.
And there's also a problem of snobbery. So for about 2 or 3 decades, my industry, the newspaper industry, has done a terrible job in looking down its nose at a lot of these digital channels. Up till very, very recently, if you mention something like YouTube or Facebook, people would sniff and say that's not real media. That's absolute nonsense, and it's a very, very painful mistake that we make, because then we get the election people like Donald Trump. We see what's going on in Eastern European countries that the Taoiseach.
So how do you get that? How do you get that balance right when you're saying look to traditional media for your trustworthy news, when the reality is that people aren't necessarily looking there in their droves anymore?
And I think that's, again, the challenge of the funding model, because if you look at where the money is going, RTE1 and RTE Radio 1 are dominant across a key sector, and that's where most of that sector go and get their information. Everybody else is going to a whole range of other places. And I think if it's Seamus' point of view, can support traditional media and local media to get engaged with these people, because if you look at where most of the talent in RTE has come from, it's from local radio, it's local newspapers, and it's places like here. So there's a depth of talent there that could be brought through if the right kind of investment was made, if there was encouragement and development through the colleges and academia to bring this kind of cohort into the kind of mainstream and understand better how people engage with content, because they don't engage with it very much in the linear format.
Just on the big picture about the national broadcaster and the purpose it serves, like people would say, that should be funded accordingly, because they're making programmes for fringe communities, not mainstream, because they're important, because they're worthy, and you won't necessarily get them elsewhere.
But again, I think to Finola's point, that's where the model again, I think is wrong. If you have a dual model and you're chasing a commercial audience versus a public service audience, you can't be master to two of those
should that go? I mean, is that inherently wrong that we're seeing RTE getting this money and the transparency that Paul mentioned, that there's a concern there that we don't exactly know, is it going to sports rights, is it going to formats, or is it going to that minority programming that's very important?
Well, we've had a debate with the Oireachtas Media Committee on this, and even in terms of, what model should RTE be and whether RTE should move to what would be called a publisher-broadcaster model, that in other words, it commissions a lot of this programme from the independent production sector. And in many cases, a lot of that diversity of programming is actually being provided by the independent production sector. I think the Sound and Vision Fund, has been a wonderful example. I think the key coming out of all of this is that we still need to ensure that Irish stories are being told, that we're able to tell them not just domestically, but indeed to an international audience. And Adrian is right, whether that is on what we might call the traditional channels or indeed on new media channels. And we haven't even talked about, as we move into the metaverse and so on, and about how we're going to be engaging in media channels. But this is going to be a challenge. And I think it's not just about a discussion of media, it's also about a discussion about our communities, our society and our democracy.
OK, key to all of this is that discussion is ongoing, Seamus, and you'd like to see something happen very quickly on this.
I'd like to see it happening, but I also have to say we were very careful about the concept of getting a public service broadcaster to do the boring bits that you think that you're worthwhile and other people make money on it. And I'm reminded of the phrase, there's nothing more eloquent than a vested interest disguised as a point of principle. So I think we have to be careful on any discussion. But it's great to be here. We're not normally allowed into this building, Paul.
And everybody should read the report, third level students in particular, media.
Great. A lot to take in there. My thanks to Finola, Paul, Seamus and Adrian. Malcolm is staying here with me.